Some relationships don't destroy you all at once. They erode you slowly, convincing you that losing pieces of yourself is the price of love, loyalty, or family. And so you stay. You tell yourself it's not that bad, that it's just a phase, that you're strong enough to handle it. But strength isn't staying where you're quietly dying. It's having the courage to leave when your soul starts whispering, "This isn't who you are anymore." There's a certain kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. The kind that builds from silencing your needs, from shrinking your truth to make someone else comfortable. Maybe it's in the way you edit your words before you speak, or in the way your presence is tolerated more than it's valued. These are the quiet moments where your peace starts to bleed, drop by drop, into the cracks of a life you no longer recognize. The Stoics didn't measure peace by comfort, they measured it by clarity. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgment of them. So when your mind justifies dysfunction, when your heart clings to people who dim your light, that isn't love. That's fear disguised as loyalty. And fear, as Seneca warned, is the enemy of wisdom. If this message is hitting something raw in you, if it's pulling at a truth you've been avoiding, then you're exactly where you need to be. And if what we're doing here helps you see things more clearly or feel a little less alone, there's one simple, free favor I'll ask. Hit the subscribe button. It's how we keep this space alive, one that honors truth, protects peace, and reminds you that walking away isn't giving up, it's choosing to grow. Carl Jung believed that many of the relationships we cling to aren't born out of conscious choice. They're born out of patterns we've never fully understood, deep, unconscious repetitions. The past disguised as the present. We think we're choosing love, friendship, belonging, but often we're simply gravitating toward what's familiar, not what's healthy. That old friend who always makes backhanded comments. The partner who withholds affection until you prove your worth. They aren't random. They're echoes of wounds we haven't yet named, let alone healed. Jung called this the psyche's attempt at completion, an effort to resolve unfinished business by dragging it into new roles, new faces. We're not connecting from our highest self. We're reenacting the unspoken traumas of our past. But what happens when you finally notice the pattern? Do you walk away, or do you explain it away? There's always a voice that says, "They didn't mean it," or "Maybe I'm too sensitive," or "It's not always bad." But the truth is, if someone constantly forces you to shrink, twist, or harden yourself just to stay close to them, that closeness is a cage. And this is where Jung's concept of the shadow becomes brutally honest. The people we tolerate, even when they hurt us, often mirror what we haven't dared to face in ourselves. That cold, emotionally distant partner. Maybe they awaken a familiar ache, the kind you felt as a child longing for approval that never came. That friend who constantly criticizes you. They might reflect the inner critic you've been trying to silence with external praise. We think we're being hurt by others, but often it's our own rejected parts, our own buried truths that are being triggered. So why do we stay? Because facing the shadow feels more terrifying than blaming someone else. It's easier to call them toxic than to ask why you tolerated it. It's more comfortable to fix them than to confront what in you needed their approval in the first place. We hand others the mirror because looking directly at ourselves can feel like staring into a void. But what if we picked the mirror up for ourselves? What if the things that offend us most in others are the things we've disowned within? Is leaving then an act of weakness, or is it actually an act of strength? Most of us are conditioned to think that walking away is quitting, that letting go means failure. But Marcus Aurelius reminded us, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. And if your daily thoughts are filled with self-doubt, second-guessing, emotional damage control, then your soul is slowly being dyed in a color that doesn't belong to you. Walking away isn't about rejecting people. It's about refusing to abandon yourself any longer. It's choosing to unlearn the need for chaos. It's saying no to reenactments and yes to evolution. But what happens after the leaving? What does it look like to stand in the silence that follows? Would you like me to continue from here? In a world that romanticizes endurance, staying is often mistaken for strength. We hear it everywhere: ride it out, be loyal, don't give up on people. And while commitment has its place, there's a fine line between loyalty and self-betrayal. Some relationships don't challenge us to grow. They ask us to shrink. They don't invite our full presence. They require our constant performance. And yet we stay, convinced that pushing through discomfort is a virtue in itself. But is it really strength if the only thing growing is your tolerance for pain? Enduring isn't the same as evolving. Carl Jung was clear about this. True psychological growth, what he called individuation, requires a break from the unconscious patterns and false identities we've inherited. It's not just about discovering who you are, but shedding everything you are not. And that shedding process often means walking away from the very people, places, and personas that once made you feel safe. Because safety isn't always alignment. Sometimes it's a cage built out of your past. Sometimes it's an outdated version of yourself clinging to an expired identity. And the cost of staying? Your wholeness. So how do you know when it's time to let go? The Stoics taught that the highest good is living in accordance with nature, your nature. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." That clarity, that simplicity, that self-alignment, that's evolution. But to become aligned, you first have to acknowledge what's misaligned. That job that drains you, that friend who subtly undermines you, that relationship where your truth goes unheard. Jung warned that the longer we avoid these inner tensions, the more likely they are to erupt through anxiety, depression, or compulsive behavior. The soul doesn't stay quiet forever. It speaks in whispers at first, but if ignored, it will start to scream. The hard part is this: leaving doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it's done in silence, no grand speeches, no closure, just a quiet decision to stop betraying yourself. And that's where most people get stuck, not in the act of walking away, but in the guilt that follows. Guilt for choosing your peace. Guilt for growing beyond someone you once loved. Guilt for outgrowing a version of yourself that once kept you safe. But isn't guilt often just the residue of an identity that's breaking apart? What if that guilt is just the grief of evolution? Seneca said, "No man was ever wise by chance. Wisdom is earned through solitude, reflection, and often through loss. Losing who you thought you were, losing the comfort of the familiar, losing the illusion that staying means succeeding." Jung believed that what we don't consciously let go of will find a way to sabotage us from the shadows. And so individuation demands more than passive endurance. It demands active separation from illusions, from noise, from people who no longer meet you where you truly are. So the question isn't whether you're strong enough to stay. The real question is, are you brave enough to leave when staying means abandoning yourself? What would it look like to stop calling it loyalty and start calling it what it really is? Fear of the unknown masked as devotion. He lived this truth himself. His break with Freud wasn't just academic, it was existential. Jung had to detach from his mentor's ideology to discover his own voice. And it wasn't easy. Freud was more than a colleague. He was a father figure, a towering presence in the early world of psychoanalysis. But staying under his intellectual shadow would have meant suppressing the very insights Jung felt called to explore. The collective unconscious, archetypes, the spiritual dimensions of the psyche. These weren't small disagreements, they were entire paradigms that clashed. And yet, Jung knew he couldn't evolve without stepping away. So he did. The rupture with Freud wasn't clean or mutual, it was devastating. Freud fainted during one of their final conversations. That's how deep their psychological entanglement ran. But from that split, something entirely new was born. Jung's own process of individuation required him to walk away from the safety of Freud's approval, to step into isolation, to risk being misunderstood. And through that aloneness, he created an entire framework that would later help millions better understand themselves. Analytical psychology didn't come from comfort, it came from confrontation. And not just with Freud, but with Jung's own inner world. That's what made it powerful. His theories weren't abstract, they were lived. So the question becomes, what are you still clinging to because it once made you feel seen? And what might be waiting for you on the other side of your own rupture? Because rupture, though painful, is often the gateway to reinvention. It breaks the illusion of safety, it forces clarity, and in doing so, it clears space for something truer to emerge. Most people fear these moments of separation, not because they're wrong, but because they challenge the identity we've built around someone else's acceptance. But Seneca wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." And how much of your life has been spent contorting yourself just to keep certain relationships intact? We call it loyalty. We call it compromise, but deep down, we know, when we're not being honest with ourselves, we pay for it. The cost is subtle at first. A little self-censorship, a little emotional withdrawal, but over time, that cost becomes unbearable. You feel it in your body, in your silence, in the aching dissonance between who you are and who you're pretending to be. That's not a phase. That's your psyche begging for alignment. So what if letting go is the most faithful thing you can do, not to others, but to your own growth? Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." That choice often starts in the aftermath of rupture, in the quiet space where old roles dissolve and a new self begins to form, not all at once, but piece by piece, as you reclaim the energy you gave away trying to belong. And belonging, it's not about fitting in. It's about becoming so grounded in your truth that the right people, the right path, begin to find you. But before that clarity comes, there's always the chaos of letting go, the grief, the second-guessing, the fear that you've made a mistake, that you'll end up alone, that you'll regret the silence. But isn't it also possible that what you'll find in that silence is your own voice? And if you could finally hear yourself clearly, what might you say back? Because walking away doesn't just mean losing someone else. It often feels like losing yourself. The ego doesn't fear solitude nearly as much as it fears uncertainty. That sinking question, who am I without them? It's not rhetorical. It's an identity crisis, a rupture in the narrative you've built your life around. You're not just letting go of a person, you're letting go of the version of yourself that existed with them. And when that identity has been reinforced by years of habits, roles, and emotional patterns, it feels like stepping into an abyss, a kind of death before rebirth. Carl Jung called this the fear of the void, a psychological emptiness that confronts us when the structures we've clung to start to fall away. But here's the paradox. The void we fear is often the space where our truest self is waiting. Why do we choose pain over possibility? Because we confuse what's familiar with what's safe. It's a tragic trick of the mind. The discomfort we know becomes a sort of comfort. It's predictable, it's mapped. And the brain loves patterns, even the painful ones. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality," and that couldn't be more accurate when it comes to letting go. We imagine ourselves shattered, lost, incapable of rebuilding. We project catastrophe onto solitude. But solitude, in its truest form, isn't abandonment. It's clarity. It's the shedding of noise, of distortion, of borrowed voices. So why does it still feel unbearable? Is it really love if it costs you your peace? Jung believed that the journey toward wholeness required the dismantling of false identities, not because they're bad, but because they're incomplete. He argued that we don't become who we are by adding more, but by subtracting what is not ours. The attachments we cling to, many of them are borrowed, inherited beliefs, imposed roles, emotional debts passed down through generations. And until we step into the void and allow them to fall away, we'll keep repeating the same cycles in new disguises. So then what does freedom actually look like? Not a sudden rush of peace, not a perfect understanding of who you are, but the willingness to sit in the silence without rushing to fill it, the courage to let your identity rebuild itself from the inside out, not from the expectations of those around you. That space, empty, terrifying, raw, is where individuation begins. It's where you stop performing and start becoming. And in that quiet, when the noise dies down and there's no one left to impress or please, who do you finally meet? Jung would say this is the soul's compromise. We trade our authenticity for the illusion of belonging. We start off by biting our tongue once or twice, thinking it's no big deal. But eventually, we don't even recognize our own voice anymore. We shapeshift to keep the peace, wear masks to be accepted, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, we begin to vanish. Not on the outside, but on the inside. And what vanishes isn't weakness, it's our vitality, our aliveness, our truth. The Stoics warned us about this kind of self-abandonment. Epictetus taught that it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them. And when our opinion of ourselves is constantly filtered through the lens of what others might think, we lose our center. We become emotionally dissonant, split between the truth we feel and the image we maintain. That dissonance isn't just uncomfortable, it's corrosive. It wears down your nervous system, it floods your thoughts, it leaks into your sleep, and eventually your body starts speaking the truth your mouth refused to say, in the form of anxiety, burnout, fatigue, that strange heaviness in your chest that has no name but feels like grief. But what are you really postponing by staying in something that chips away at your peace? Is it love, or just the fear of being alone? Because there's a huge difference between the two, though in the moment they can feel nearly identical. Love is expansive. It makes room for your growth. It honors your evolving self. But fear is restrictive. It clings. It manipulates. It whispers that you'll be nothing without them. It convinces you that silence is safer than self-expression, that discomfort is the cost of connection. But what kind of connection requires you to lie to yourself just to maintain it? Jung understood that most of what we call attachment is just a defense mechanism, our ego's way of clinging to the familiar in order to avoid the void. But the irony is, the more we cling, the emptier we become. And the more we pretend everything's fine, the further we drift from our inner truth. Over time, this doesn't just hurt, it hollows us out. So is staying truly noble, or is it just a fear of solitude in disguise? Seneca once said, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you." But how often do we do the opposite? How often do we surround ourselves with people who keep us stagnant, just because stagnation feels safer than transformation? We hold on to relationships that no longer fit because they're woven into our identity, because the silence after leaving feels unbearable, because starting over feels like failure. But what if staying is the real failure? The failure to listen, to evolve, to choose courage over comfort. What if being alone isn't the danger we've made it out to be? What if it's the beginning of hearing your own voice again, clearly, honestly, without distortion? And if you gave that voice a moment of your full attention, what would it say? Solitude is one of the most misunderstood states of being. We're conditioned to avoid it like a plague. We equate it with loneliness, with abandonment, with the terrifying possibility that we might not be enough on our own. We're taught that being alone means something went wrong, that someone left, that we failed, that we've been rejected or forgotten. But Carl Jung saw it differently. He believed solitude wasn't punishment. It was purification. A sacred space where the distractions fall away, and what's left is the unfiltered truth of who you are beneath the noise. It's only in solitude that we stop performing. No more adjusting your tone to avoid conflict. No more rehearsing your emotions to fit someone else's expectations. There are no roles to play when no one's watching. Just you, your thoughts, and that quiet voice within, the one that often gets drowned out in the chaos of connection. And while that can feel terrifying at first, it's also liberating. Because when the masks fall, when the echo of others' opinions finally fades, you get to meet yourself in your rawest form. Why do we resist that meeting so much? Because it forces us to face what we've avoided, the grief we buried under busyness, the truth we covered with people-pleasing, the desires we traded for acceptance. In the presence of others, it's easy to distract ourselves. But alone, there's nowhere to run. And yet, that stillness, that confrontation, is where real transformation begins. Jung referred to it as individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating every part of yourself, the conscious, the unconscious, the light, the shadow. But that process doesn't happen in a crowd. It happens in the crucible of solitude. The Stoics echoed this. Marcus Aurelius, an emperor surrounded by advisors and pressure, still turned inward for guidance. He wrote, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. The external world is loud, demanding, full of opinions. But your inner world? That's where wisdom waits. That's where your intuition sharpens. That's where clarity begins to form, not all at once, but gradually, like mist lifting from a mountain. Still, the initial quiet can feel unbearable. We're so used to outsourcing our sense of self to relationships, achievements, roles, that solitude feels like emptiness. But what if that emptiness isn't a void to be feared, but a space waiting to be filled by your own truth? What if solitude is less about absence and more about presence? The presence of your own unfiltered experience. The presence of your authentic self emerging from beneath layers of performance and expectation. And in that presence, something else begins to stir. A sense of peace not dependent on approval. A clarity not shaped by the voices around you. A strength that doesn't need to be validated to exist. It's in this space that we stop asking, "What do they think of me?" and start asking, "What do I truly think of myself?" That shift is everything, because once you know who you are without the noise, no one can manipulate you with silence. But if solitude holds that kind of power, then what becomes possible when you stop fearing being alone and start embracing it as your most sacred ground? Because silence has a way of amplifying everything we've worked so hard to suppress. When the noise dies down, the pain gets louder. The distractions fade, the performances end. And what's left is the truth, the bruised parts of you that you silenced for the sake of keeping others comfortable. You start to hear that small voice you ignored, the one that said, "This isn't working," long before things actually fell apart. And you realize, sometimes too late, that what you labeled as love was just a carefully disguised form of self-abandonment. You loved them, sure, but at the cost of leaving yourself behind. That's the kind of realization that doesn't whisper, it roars. Carl Jung believed that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And relationships can become one of the most socially acceptable ways to do exactly that. You lose yourself in someone else's needs, moods, and expectations, not because you're generous, but because you're scared of what you'll find if you stand alone. So you sacrifice your voice to maintain harmony, not realizing that silence is often the loudest kind of betrayal, the betrayal of self. But pain, contrary to what we've been taught, isn't the enemy. It's information. It's the psyche's way of waving a red flag, trying to pull you out of the fog of denial. And denial is what keeps us stuck. Not because we're blind, but because we choose not to see. Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." But examining your life, especially your relationships, takes courage. It requires you to admit that you've been complicit in your own suffering, not because you deserved it, but because part of you thought enduring it made you virtuous. Isn't it strange how we sometimes confuse endurance with integrity? We think staying silent is noble. We think swallowing our truth makes us stronger. But what if the opposite is true? What if strength lies in confrontation, not with others, but with ourselves? What if the pain you feel isn't a sign you're broken, but a signal that something vital inside you is waking up? Plato believed that truth is the beginning of every good to the gods and of every good to man. And truth begins when denial ends, when you admit that something has been off for a long time, that your needs are not being met, that your joy feels manufactured, that the connection you've been protecting is draining you more than it's nourishing you. The minute you allow that truth to surface, even if just in a whisper, you reclaim a piece of yourself that was lost. So why do we still hesitate to speak up? Because confrontation risks rejection, it risks discomfort, it risks change. But Aristotle reminded us, courage is the first of human qualities because it is the quality which guarantees the others. And without courage, we stay stuck in cycles we've outgrown, clinging to relationships that no longer recognize who we are becoming. The Stoics knew that clarity comes not through comfort, but through contrast. Epictetus taught that we must distinguish between what is within our control and what is not. Speaking up is within your control. Whether someone else can meet you there, that's not your burden. Your only task is to stop silencing yourself for the sake of peace that isn't real. Because real peace doesn't come from pretending, it comes from truth. And if you allowed yourself to speak that truth, even just once, what might finally begin to heal? So what happens when you finally do? When you stop making excuses for what no longer fits? When you say quietly but with full conviction, "This isn't for me anymore," and you don't say it with rage or resentment, but with clarity. That clarity doesn't always feel empowering at first. It often feels like loss. Because the moment you detach, the world doesn't immediately celebrate you. People may look at you with confusion or disappointment. Some will call you selfish, ungrateful, too sensitive, too distant, and worse, a part of you might believe them. Because you've gotten used to the chaos. It became your normal. And walking away from what's familiar, even when it's toxic, can leave you feeling disoriented. Peace isn't always comfortable at first. In fact, it can feel eerie, like standing in a room where the screaming has stopped, but the echo still lingers. That silence can be terrifying, but that silence is also sacred, because in it you begin to hear something that's been drowned out for too long, your own voice. And this is where the real work begins. Walking away is only the threshold. What follows is what Carl Jung called the dark night of the soul. It's the descent, the emotional unraveling that happens after you let go of the version of yourself that was built for someone else. You grieve, not just the person you walked away from, but the identity you formed around them. The way you made yourself smaller, the roles you played, the dreams you silenced. You begin to see clearly the ways you abandoned your own becoming in exchange for acceptance. Plato once said, "The first and greatest victory is to conquer yourself." And that's exactly what this phase demands, because the moment you step into solitude, you meet the parts of yourself you avoided by staying busy, needed, or entangled. You realize how much of your self-worth was tied to someone else's validation. You recognize the projections, how the love you gave was often a plea for someone to reflect it back, just so you could feel whole again. And in that recognition, there's pain, but there's also something else. Space. And space is everything. Space to breathe, to reflect, to choose, not just react, not just survive, but to finally live on your terms. This is the beginning of sovereignty, the ability to build your life from within, rather than through the approval of others. The Stoics would call this the return to what is within your control. As Epictetus said, freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control. And few things lie more outside your control than another person's perception of you. Will you rush to fill it? Distract yourself with new noise, new people, new chaos? Or will you sit in it long enough to become reacquainted with who you are without the masks? Jung believed that we could not become whole unless we integrated both the light and the shadow, both the strength and the sorrow. That's what this process is. It's not about fixing yourself. It's about finding yourself. Beneath the roles, beneath the coping, beneath the conditioning. And when you finally meet that self, the one who doesn't need to perform or explain or apologize, what would it feel like to just be? And from that place of being, what kind of life could you finally build? Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He meant it quite literally. When you're unaware of the wounds shaping your decisions, you repeat the same storylines and call them destiny. You date the same type of person and wonder why it always ends the same way. You silence your voice in every room you enter and label it humility. You pour yourself into people who never fully see you, convinced it's love. But none of this is fate. It's programming. And walking away is how you take the pen back. It's how you begin rewriting your life from a place of awareness, not survival. You stop letting your history control your horizon. And then something remarkable happens. Slowly, without force, you stop searching for people to complete you. You begin to shed the belief that you are broken, that someone else has the missing piece. You realize there's nothing missing, only parts you've been taught to hide. And as those parts come home to you, the people around you begin to shift. Not because you're changing your standards out of fear, but because your self-worth is no longer negotiable. You stop craving mirrors and start becoming the light. And isn't that the point? We weren't meant to stay the same. The universe doesn't reward stagnation, it rewards growth. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that life is change, and resistance to change is resistance to nature itself. When we cling to what no longer serves us, we're clinging to decay. And decay isn't loyalty, it's self-sabotage. Every relationship is either aligned with your evolution, or it's an anchor wrapped in nostalgia, guilt, or fear. So how do you tell the difference? Pay attention to what your soul feels like after the conversation ends. Not what they said, not how you smiled, but what your body did when you walked away. Did it shrink? Did it ache? Or did it breathe? That's your truth. and it's often quieter than the noise of your rationalizations. But as Aristotle said, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And wisdom doesn't always come dressed in comfort. Sometimes it looks like saying goodbye. Sometimes it means disappointing others to finally stop disappointing yourself. Cutting the rope isn't cruelty, it's clarity. You're not abandoning them. You're returning to you. You're choosing to no longer carry what was never yours to hold. And in doing so, you create space for peace, for healing, for alignment. Socrates said, "The secret of change is to focus all your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new." Letting go is not a war, it's a release. It's trusting that your worth isn't tied to how long you endure, but how deeply you honor what's true for you now. So when you feel the tension between who you've been and who you're becoming, what will you choose? Will you hold on out of habit, or will you let go and finally grow into the self that's been waiting just beneath the weight? But how do you know it's time? You know it's time when you begin to feel like a guest in your own skin, when their presence becomes a performance, when you walk away from conversations feeling not heard, but edited. It's subtle at first. You start monitoring your tone, avoiding certain truths, laughing on cue, but over time, it becomes your default. You're no longer living, you're managing perceptions. The most dangerous part? You might start believing that version of you is real. Marcus Aurelius warned, "Never value anything as profitable to yourself that shall compel you to break your promise, lose your self-respect, or to hate any man." And yet we do it daily, break small promises to ourselves just to maintain surface harmony. But that harmony comes at a cost. When you wake up and realize your life feels scripted instead of lived, that's not weakness. That's your inner self knocking, asking if you're ready to stop performing. It's time when you leave the conversation feeling smaller instead of seen, when every interaction becomes a negotiation between your truth and their comfort. When you start to ask yourself, what version of me do they like best, instead of, who am I really? Aristotle once said, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. But how can you know yourself when you're constantly reshaping your identity to fit inside someone else's expectations? So what do you do when you wake up and realize you're not living, you're merely enduring? That's the moment, the hinge, the turning point, and when it comes, the choice is yours. You can stay and slowly erode into someone you no longer recognize, or you can walk away and rise, not immediately, not effortlessly, but inevitably, because the self that honors its truth will always find its way home. Or you can walk away, not in anger, not in haste, but with clarity, with grace, with the quiet understanding that walking away isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new chapter. And no, it won't be immediate. It won't be effortless. Healing rarely is, but it will be inevitable, because the self that honors its truth will always find its way back home, no matter how lost it's been. Plato taught that the measure of a man is what he does with power, and there is no greater personal power than choosing your peace over your patterns, choosing evolution over familiarity, choosing your truth, even when your voice shakes. So when that moment comes, when you feel the pull between comfort and calling, will you keep performing, or will you finally start living? You know, it's easy to forget that peace isn't just a feeling, it's a direction. It's not passive. It's not the absence of noise. It's something you have to protect, cultivate and choose every single day, especially in a world that rewards chaos and calls it connection. We're told to be accommodating, to keep relationships alive at any cost, to never give up on people, even when keeping them means slowly giving up on ourselves. But Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." And I would add, if it doesn't bring peace, don't stay in it. Because your light matters, not just in how it warms others, but in how it keeps you alive. If you spend your days dimming yourself to fit into spaces that don't value you, your flame doesn't just fade, it flickers in confusion. But when you tend to that flame, nurture it, feed it, guard it, it starts to grow. And it grows not to burn anyone else, but to guide you, to keep you steady in the dark. And eventually, it becomes bright enough to light the way for others too. Because that's the thing about healing. It doesn't just change you, it changes the atmosphere around you. So I'll ask you this, with no judgment, only honesty. Who are you without them? Not the version of you that contorted to meet their needs, not the you who played small to avoid conflict, but the real you, the one you may have silenced, the one who always knew what peace felt like, even if you were never given permission to pursue it. And if you let that version rise, if you chose your peace over your past, who could you become? Have you ever had to make that choice? To walk away from a relationship, a role, a version of yourself just to breathe again? What did you discover in that quiet space after the noise died down? If you feel safe to share, drop your story in the comments. I promise you, someone out there is searching for the strength they don't yet know they have, and your story might be the thing that reminds them it's possible. And if this message stirred something in you, if it helped you name a feeling you've carried alone or gave you language for a decision you've been postponing, consider subscribing. We're building something here that's rooted in awareness, in courage, in the kind of wisdom the Stoics lived by. Not loud, but lasting. Not reactive, but resilient. And above all, remember this. Choosing peace isn't selfish. It's sacred. It's not an escape from others. It's a return to yourself. See you in the next one.